2011 was an interesting year in climate change. There was a big push to get agriculture included in the negotiations with a specific request for something called a work program, which is basically just a tool to allow people with interest on climate change and also research knowledge to provide evidence that the negotiators can take into account in an official way as opposed to just going out and reading it in the newspapers. So that push started back in the early part of 2011 and continued on throughout the year. At the end of the year, at the Durban negotiations, there were some very high-level efforts to make this happen, including the President of South Africa and the former head of the United Nations and many other senior figures who recognized the importance of the effects of climate change on agriculture, but also the need to do something early in terms of thinking about how to deal with those consequences. The work program was not officially approved at the negotiations, but there was put in place a mechanism to start the process. This is kind of classical international negotiation business. With submissions that could take place in the early part of 2012 and then a more formal discussion taking place in Bonn in the middle of 2012, and then with hopes, at least by those of us who are interested in agriculture and climate change effects, that there would be an official program approved in the end of 2012 in the next international negotiations. So that was one of the big things that happened on the plus and minus side with respect to climate change in agriculture. The other thing I would say is that we have seen record-breaking weather events in 2011 and beginning in 2012 as well. And while we can't attribute any specific event to climate change, we can see that there are increasing evidence, research results suggesting that these weather events are in some way associated with the greenhouse gases that are emitted because of human activities. So more pressure is being brought to bear on figuring out how to slow the increase of those greenhouse gas emissions. And that also is a place where agriculture has to play a role. Agriculture actually is directly or indirectly responsible for about a third of total emissions. And while the developing countries' emissions are relatively low today, in some places they're growing rapidly. So we need to think about low emissions development strategies for the countries that we currently call developing and we hope will be developed in the not too distant future. So those countries need to think about how they can speed up their growth processes, but at the same time reduce the emissions that come with growth on a business as usual pathway. So, as I said, 2012 is where there will be yet again another push for this work program in the negotiations. But I think there's a growing recognition that we can't have climate change efforts in agriculture independent of the larger food security challenges. Research that we produced at the very end of 2010 and was circulated widely in 2011 indicated that while climate change is important, the challenges are large for food security, there are other large challenges as well. And so focusing on just the climate change policies without thinking about the larger food security challenges is a mistake, as is thinking about the larger food security challenges without taking into account the effects of climate change would also be a mistake. So we need to do policies and programs around the world that look for the synergies between improving food security, enhancing well-being, and dealing with the coming consequences of climate change.